Secondly, our next speaker is Willemijn Appels. She is the Senior Research Chair at Lethbridge College, leading the Mueller Irrigation Group. Willemijn Appels is a Senior Research Chair at the Lethbridge College, leading the Mueller Irrigation Group. Trained as the hydrologist and soil physicist at, and bear with me, Wageningen. Did I say it right? Oh, I got a thumbs up. Wonderful. Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Her expertise is measuring and modeling water flow and solute transport above and below the soil surface. The Mueller Irrigation Group was established in 2016 and investigates how new scientific findings in the field of agricultural water management can be translated into practical applications for producers in the irrigated agriculture sector of southern Alberta. The group works the group works on new sensor systems and management practices to achieve better water and nutrient use efficiency in collaboration with industry partners across the irrigation sector. With that, welcome, Willemijn.
Thank you, Melissa, and hello all. Oki from the Lethbridge area and Treaty 7. So in follow-up to what Helen has just talked about how agriculture affects water, I am now going to talk about how we get water into agriculture in the first place. Yes, there we go. So within the Palliser Triangle and the prairies, it is fairly clear why we would want to irrigate. It's a semi-arid area, and if you were to grow a reference alfalfa crop during the growing season, you'd be short about 0.5 meter of water for optimal plant development during the growing season. So my talk will focus on the black triangle within Palliser's Triangle. So here, just the heartland of irrigation, not just in Alberta, but also in Canada. The benefits of irrigation, which is really the control of applying your water to a crop when it needs it and where it needs it, mostly lie in the fact that you can produce more yield for any crop that could also be grown under dryland conditions, as well as that you have access to a much larger choice of crops. So 80% of irrigated cropland in the Alberta irrigation districts is typical cereals and forages and oilseeds, but that other 20% is specialty crops. So seed crops, potatoes, sugar beets, hemp, even mint, are crops that you would not be able to grow successfully without having access to water to make sure that the crop meets its evapotranspiration needs during the season. The additional yields, the additional value that can be created through growing specialty crops means that of the Alberta agricultural land base, of which 4.4% is irrigated, so that's a very tiny amount. On that 4.4%, 27% of its agricultural GDP is generated on a yearly basis. So it's an enormous multiplier of value. Water in Alberta falls under a variety of provincial jurisdictions. So first there's Alberta Environment and Protected Areas, which regulate the Water Act, and with that, the water licenses. They used to operate major dams and headworks as well, but that functionality has been transferred to Alberta Agriculture and Irrigation. And Alberta and Agriculture and Irrigation historically mostly managed the Irrigation Districts Act and ensured that agronomically irrigation was only taking place on prime lands and on regions where you would not be wasting water. Now they've got that added responsibility to oversee headworks regulation and operation as well. And then when we come down to the finer details, we get to irrigation districts, which are corporations, not-for-profit, that regulate and enable irrigation from the headworks right to the farm gate. About 85% of all irrigated lands in Alberta fall under districts or are incorporated in a district. The other 15, sometimes 20% is irrigated privately. Districts are nice because they allow farmers to not have to worry about that transfer of water. So a district will ensure that your water gets into a canal, it gets filtered or at least cleaned before it goes into a pipeline, and it gets delivered to wherever your pump or your intake for your specific field is. The downside is that you do not own a license to your own water. So the district holds the water license. Those licenses are typically old and they're large, and they then decide how much water they will allocate to each irrigated field every year. Alberta has a FITFER licensing system, so first in time, first in right, which means that theoretically every license holder gets to fill their share of water on a yearly basis based on their seniority. So the date that their license was established puts them, if it's older, then you get you're first in line, basically. That's sometimes problematic because it means that a couple of districts, which again are large water users, have access and are allowed to fill their license before certain cities, communities, or First Nations are. As an agricultural input, water stands out. It's pretty much impossible that once you've run out of water, you just go out and you make some new or you buy some new from, let's say, your factory of water breaks down and you try to import some water. That is really logistically pretty much impossible. In the southern watersheds of the South Saskatchewan River, we rely on surface waters for irrigation, which means that we rely on the snowpacks on the eastern slopes of the Rockies. They feed rivers. The melt peaks typically in June, after which the stream flow tapers off throughout the rest of the summer. And if you're lucky, you can capture all that peak flow into reservoirs and make it available for irrigation during the higher demand months of the year, which are typically July and August. So it's a finite resource. Once the snowpack is done, once the reservoir is empty, you are out of water. Under most circumstances, that is sufficient, but we've been seeing a couple of occasions where that isn't, or where it's a bit tight, let's say. And then as a sector, there's quite some trouble. Now, because irrigation districts are the license holders and not individual farmers, producers, farmers, irrigators pay only for the service of the delivery of that water. An individual farmer does not pay for the volume of water that they get to use or have used during a season. So when the districts decide that you get 12 inches of water for a certain year, regardless of whether you use only 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 inches of that water, you pay the same amount. And that presents a challenge because we all want people to save water, but how do you do that if there is not a direct financial incentive for an individual? So saving water is really a long-term game. Over the years, we have seen a decrease in the gross equivalent depth, which is the figure here on the left, which means that the amount of water, the volume of water that's diverted every year, divided by the area of land that's being irrigated with that water, that ratio has gone down over the years, a bit of stagnation in the last decade. And as you can see on the right, that is mostly because the volume remains fairly stable. It mostly responds to whether we have a wet or a dry year, but the total irrigated area has increased by quite a bit. And so an individual farmer may not be able to irrigate more when they save water, but if all the farmers within a district save water, then over time they can expand the land base that falls within that district. So that's one incentive. The second incentive is more pressing, and that is when nature and eventually your district force you to use less water than you would have liked, or than would be ideal. And currently we are looking at a situation that is forced, basically. So in this particular part of the prairies, we've been receiving less rainfall than normal, which is basically a 3-year drought going into our 4th year. And then in combination with warmer summers, means that we've been relying heavily on irrigation for crop production. Our reservoirs here on the right, the current reservoir level, especially in the southern tributaries of the irrigation system, is very, very low. The red line is current. We would like the red line to be in between this green and this blue line, but we're not there yet. And with the current status of the snowpacks at the 25th percentile line or under that, we're not very likely to fill up these reservoirs to the maximum of their capacity or the ideal capacity at the beginning of the growing season this summer. So it is likely that, especially in the districts located next to or around the Oldman River system, that we'll be looking at lower allocations than usual. That may intensify that situation through climate change, as I would say a fairly global trend. We'll probably be seeing earlier starts and later ends to the growing season, higher temperatures driving more growing degree days and more ET potential. However, there is some hydrological work that would suggest that in terms of stream flow, we might be seeing mostly shifts in stream flow. So we're going from green to blue to red with earlier peaks, but potentially larger peaks. This work out of the Global Institute for Water Security would even suggest 5 to 10% to 20% more stream flow by the end of this century. Apart from these natural drivers, we're looking at significant population growth and industry growth, which are also putting increasing demands on water. So all of this is to say that, irrigation, especially during considering these climate trends, is probably going to be more important, especially when you want to diversify your economy and create more economic value through agriculture. That we might be a bit lucky in the sense that with the volume of water that will be available for that, but that we're also going to see multiple pressures on water resources as we move forward. What are our options? Now, the irrigation industry really eyes that previous graph of the stream flow with high levels of optimism. They're like, look, we'll get more water. If we just build a couple of reservoirs and some better infrastructure, we will be able to capture that all and irrigate and expand to our heart's content. A lot of the current work and in modernization and updating is oriented to that type of thought. And in a way, they have a point. If we can optimize reservoirs in terms of capacity as well as operation, and we transform more canals into pipelines, we will have to extract less water from the natural river system, use it, and not have to sort of waste it back into the river. Now, I say waste from a perspective of taking away from the natural flow at a certain location and then reinserting water hundreds of kilometers further downstream. We'd rather leave that in the natural ecosystem for the entire length of the river. An important part here is that the Oldman River, the Bow River are all close to new licenses. So anytime a district or a farmer would want to irrigate more and more land, and they will have to do that through existing or within the existing volume that is approved for withdrawal for agriculture. So from the irrigation industry's perspective, adding reservoirs, adding more and less leaky infrastructure will help achieve that goal. From the perspective of a lot of environmental groups, this is not per se desirable, but if it can be done on existing sites or by expanding existing sites, then maybe the impact is not completely detrimental. At the producer level, there are a couple of options. Most of the time we focus on adopting better irrigation methods. So either converting sprinklers or going away from sprinkler technology altogether and moving to drip technology, as well as using models, sensors, etc., to get to a very precise delivery of water at a certain point in time. Now, that has some potential for sure. There are still a lot of producers out here who irrigate because they see their neighbor irrigating and think, oh yeah, I should have done that. However, when you do the sort of the gross math over the region, most farmers tend to under irrigate. And so relying on sensors might actually mean that you be withdrawing more water. Now, that may lead to better yields as well. So your water use efficiency might be higher, but it may still mean that we're not actually reducing the volume of water that we are withdrawing from the river systems. And in the end, a certain crop still needs a certain amount of water. So an important role will be on breeders to come up with crops that are more drought tolerant, or varieties of potatoes or wheat or canola that can deal better with smaller amounts of water. At the moment, a tool that farmers have is to play with their crop mixes. So let's say you have 10 fields and you have to decide 10 irrigated fields. We are only getting 10 inches of irrigation water per year, which is not enough for to grow a potato crop without any decent rainfall. You can choose to plant, let's say, 5 of those 10 fields in wheat, short those fields a little bit on water, and move that allocation from your wheat fields to your own potato field. So producers have that, within most of our districts, have that opportunity to decide for themselves, like, okay, I can start this crop, or I can stress this crop a little bit more while I make sure that I put my water somewhere where it really makes a difference. And finally, but definitely not the least important option, is that we need to think more on the watershed scale and cooperate and quantify what are we actually doing a bit better than we used to. So we are currently in a situation of drought that is very similar to the 2001-2002 drought. We're not 100% sure if this is going to happen. In 2002, one big rainstorm effectively ended a drought that everyone was terrified of and had already seen some significant impacts of. That might well happen again this year. But finally, or thankfully, this time the province and the stakeholders in the irrigation industry decided not to wait for it. And so water sharing agreements have been started. The goal of that is to see if we can soften that first in time, first in right situation. So irrigation districts have committed to putting people and animals before plants. But if they want, and they want to pool rank in terms of diverting water, they can. Ideally, they would not do that and say that, well, agree that everyone will take a little bit less water than they're officially entitled to, in order to ensure that communities can remain vibrant and get their water at a reasonable price. And an effort. Some of the smaller communities in the foothills have been trucking in their water since last summer, because reservoir levels had dropped so low that their intake pipe is now above the water level. You would think, normally speaking, that in the river systems that we're talking about, so the Bow River, Mill River, Old Man River, with their 90%, 92% of blue, which is irrigation, collaboration shouldn't be an issue. But still, there are some significantly large economic pressures, even within these smaller gray areas, as well as social pressures. And those need to be addressed rather earlier and before a drought really has an impact than sort of after the fact. So in summary, water is at the same time very highly valued as well as undervalued in Alberta and in the agricultural sector here. It'll have the spotlight while we are in a drought situation. I am hoping that it will remain there for a while and that we think a little bit more in depth as to how we want to use the water resources that we have and use them wisely, so that everyone, including environment, including the stream itself, can enjoy and reap the benefits of having water in a river system. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That was an excellent presentation. Definitely have some questions popping up in the Q&A. So after we wrap up with the presentations and have our break, we'll address those. Excited to get into those.